The television studio of Canal Sport International was buzzing with the usual pre-show energy that accompanied high-profile interviews, technicians adjusting cameras and sound equipment, while makeup artists applied final touches to ensure everyone looked perfect under the harsh studio lights. Tonight's guest was Cristiano Ronaldo, scheduled for what was supposed to be a routine promotional interview about his latest charitable foundation and upcoming match fixtures. The show's host, Ricardo Vega, was known throughout Spanish media for his provocative interviewing style and his ability to generate controversial moments that drove social media engagement and boosted ratings. Vega had built his career on pushing boundaries, asking uncomfortable questions, and creating the kind of confrontational television that kept viewers talking long after the cameras stopped rolling. He saw every interview as an opportunity to make headlines, and tonight he had prepared what he believed would be his most memorable moment yet. Ronaldo arrived at the studio in his usual professional manner, greeting the production staff courteously and taking his place across from Vega at the sleek interview desk. He had done hundreds of similar interviews over the years, and while he always remained polite and engaging, those who knew him well could sense that he was going through the motions of media obligations rather than genuinely enjoying the process. Still, he understood the importance of these appearances for maintaining his public profile and promoting causes that mattered to him. The interview began conventionally enough, with Vega asking standard questions about Ronaldo's training regimen, his thoughts on the upcoming season, and his various business ventures. Ronaldo answered each question thoughtfully, but without particular enthusiasm, clearly expecting another routine sports interview that would be forgotten by the next news cycle. The conversation flowed smoothly through discussions of tactics, team dynamics, and personal goals, with both men settling into the familiar rhythm of professional sports media. But Vega had been building towards something else entirely, waiting for the right moment to spring the trap he had carefully prepared. About 15 minutes into the interview, he shifted his tone and leaned forward with the predatory smile of someone about to deliver what he believed would be a devastating blow. "Cristiano," Vega said, his voice taking on a more serious tone that immediately changed the atmosphere in the studio. "I want to shift to a more serious topic. You've been quite vocal recently about various humanitarian issues, particularly regarding the situation in Palestine. Some people have praised your compassion, but others have questioned whether you fully understand the complexities of the situation." Ronaldo's expression became more guarded, recognizing that the interview was about to take a turn into territory that required careful navigation. "I try to speak out when I see human suffering," he replied cautiously. "I believe that children, regardless of their nationality or background, deserve protection and safety." Vega nodded with false sympathy, setting up for his prepared attack. "Of course, we all care about children's welfare. But let me ask you this. When you see images of Palestinian children in these conflict zones, how do you know they're not just actors? How do you know these aren't staged photos designed to manipulate public opinion? After all, we've seen numerous instances of what some people call Pallywood, fake scenarios created to generate sympathy." The question hung in the air like a poison cloud. The production staff, who had been going about their routine duties, suddenly stopped what they were doing and turned their attention to the interview desk. Camera operators adjusted their focus instinctively, understanding that they were about to capture something significant. Ronaldo's face went through a series of subtle changes, first confusion, then disbelief, then a cold anger that anyone who knew him well would recognize as dangerous. "I'm sorry," Ronaldo said slowly, his voice carefully controlled. "Did you just suggest that images of injured and dying children might be fake? That parents grieving for their dead children might be actors performing for cameras?" Vega, either oblivious to the danger he was walking into, or too committed to his provocative approach to back down, doubled down on his inflammatory suggestion. "Well, Cristiano, you have to admit that in today's world of social media and information warfare, we need to be skeptical of what we see. These images are very convenient for one side of the conflict, aren't they? And you, as a public figure with millions of followers, have a responsibility to verify information before you share it with your audience. The studio had become completely silent except for the low hum of electronic equipment. Ronaldo stared at Vega for a long moment, and those watching could see something shifting in his demeanor. This was no longer a celebrity giving a polite interview. This was a man confronting something that struck at the core of his humanity. When Ronaldo finally spoke, his voice was quiet but carried a weight that seemed to fill the entire studio. Ricardo, let me make sure I understand what you're saying. You're suggesting that when I see a photograph of a child in a hospital bed, covered in dust and blood, crying for parents who may be dead, my first thought should be to wonder if that child is an actor? You're telling me that when I see a father carrying the lifeless body of his daughter through rubble, I should question whether that grief is genuine. Vega, perhaps beginning to realize that his provocative approach was backfiring spectacularly, tried to clarify his position. I'm simply saying that in complex geopolitical situations, we need to be careful about. No, Ronaldo interrupted, his voice gaining strength and authority. You're not talking about being careful or responsible. You're talking about something much uglier than that. You're talking about dehumanizing children by suggesting that their suffering might be fictional. You're asking me to look at images of human tragedy and respond with suspicion rather than compassion. The camera operators were now focused entirely on Ronaldo, understanding that they were witnessing something unprecedented. This wasn't the usual sports celebrity carefully navigating controversial topics. This was someone who had been pushed beyond the boundaries of diplomatic politeness into genuine moral outrage. Let me tell you something about those children you're calling actors, Ronaldo continued, his voice now carrying clearly throughout the studio. I've met some of them, not through photographs or videos, but in person. I've looked into their eyes and seen fear that no child should ever experience. I've watched doctors working desperately to save young lives in facilities that lack basic medical supplies because of blockades and restrictions. I've seen parents who have lost everything but still find the strength to comfort their remaining children. Vega attempted to interrupt, but Ronaldo continued without pause, his words gaining momentum and power. You want to know how I know their suffering is real? Because suffering is something you can't fake. Real grief, real pain, real fear. These things leave marks that no amount of acting can replicate. When a child has watched their home destroyed, when they've lost family members, when they've gone without food or clean water, it shows in ways that go beyond what any camera can capture. The production team was now completely transfixed by what was unfolding. Sound engineers who had been adjusting levels were frozen at their equipment, makeup artists had stopped their work, and even the usually bustling backstage area had grown quiet as word spread that something extraordinary was happening on set. But let's talk about your question more directly, Ronaldo said, his tone becoming more pointed. You ask how I know these images are real? I could ask you, how do you know they're fake? What evidence do you have that thousands of doctors, journalists, aid workers, and international observers are all participating in some massive deception? What proof do you offer that parents grieving for their children are merely performing for cameras? Vega was now visibly uncomfortable, realizing that his attempt to create controversy had instead created a situation where he was being systematically dismantled on his own show. Cristiano, I never said they were definitely fake. I'm just suggesting we should be cautious about. Cautious, Ronaldo repeated, his voice dripping with disdain. You want to be cautious about showing compassion for suffering children. You want to be skeptical about human tragedy. You want to question whether pain is real before you allow yourself to feel empathy. Is that the kind of caution you're recommending? The interview had completely transformed from a routine celebrity appearance into something resembling a moral reckoning. Ronaldo was no longer answering questions. He was delivering a lecture on human decency to someone who had revealed something ugly about himself on national television. Let me ask you something, Ricardo, Ronaldo said, leaning forward with an intensity that made Vega shrink back in his chair. Do you have children? Yes, I have 2 daughters, Vega replied nervously. Good. Now imagine that your daughters were trapped in a building that had collapsed around them. Imagine that they were injured, scared, calling for their father. And imagine that when pictures of their suffering appeared on television, someone suggested that maybe they were just actors, that maybe their tears were fake, that maybe their pain was manufactured for political purposes. How would that make you feel? Vega's face had gone pale, and he was clearly struggling to find words. That's different. My children aren't in a war zone. No, it's not different, Ronaldo said firmly. The only difference is geography and circumstance. Pain is pain. Fear is fear. A child crying for their parents feels the same whether they're in Madrid or Gaza, whether they're Spanish or Palestinian. And when you suggest that suffering might be fake based on who's experiencing it, you're saying that some children's lives matter less than others. The power dynamic in the studio had completely reversed. Vega, who had intended to put Ronaldo on the defensive with provocative questions, now found himself being morally dissected by someone who refused to accept the premise that human suffering should be subject to political skepticism. You know what's really tragic about your question? Ronaldo continued. It's not just that you're wrong about these children being actors. It's that your first instinct when confronted with human suffering is to question its authenticity rather than to feel compassion. It's that you've become so cynical, so disconnected from basic human empathy, that you can look at images of dying children and wonder if it's all a performance. By now, word of what was happening had spread beyond the studio. Social media was already buzzing with clips from the interview, and other television programs were cutting to live coverage of what was being described as one of the most powerful moments in recent media history. Viewers were watching not just a celebrity defending his position, but a human being standing up for the fundamental principle that suffering children deserve compassion, not skepticism. I want to be very clear about something, Ronaldo said, his voice now calm but carrying absolute conviction. When I see images of children in pain, my response is not to question whether their pain is real. My response is to ask what I can do to help end that pain. When I see families destroyed by violence, I don't wonder if their grief is genuine. I wonder how we can prevent other families from experiencing the same loss. Vega made one final attempt to salvage the interview and his professional reputation. Cristiano, surely you can understand that journalists have a responsibility to verify information and ask difficult questions. Ronaldo looked at him with an expression that mixed pity with contempt. Yes, journalists do have responsibilities. They have a responsibility to seek truth, to challenge power, and to give voice to those who can't speak for themselves. But they also have a responsibility to maintain their humanity, to recognize that behind every story are real human beings with real feelings and real suffering. What you did tonight wasn't journalism, Ricardo. It was something much smaller and uglier than that. With that, Ronaldo stood up from his chair and began removing his microphone. I think this interview is over, he said simply. I came here tonight expecting to talk about football and charity work. I didn't expect to have to defend the basic principle that children's suffering should be met with compassion rather than conspiracy theories. As Ronaldo walked off the set, the studio remained in stunned silence. Vega sat alone at the interview desk, his face flushed with embarrassment and his career prospects suddenly uncertain. The production team scrambled to figure out how to handle the remainder of their scheduled broadcast time, but it was clear that nothing they could do would overshadow what had just occurred. Within hours, clips from the interview had been viewed millions of times across various social media platforms. The hashtag #RonaldoRighteous began trending worldwide, with people sharing the video alongside their own reflections on empathy, media responsibility, and the importance of defending human dignity. News organizations around the globe picked up the story, not as a sports item, but as a significant moment in the ongoing conversation about how public figures should respond to human rights issues. But perhaps more importantly, the interview sparked conversations in households, schools, and communities about the way people respond to suffering, the importance of maintaining compassion in an increasingly cynical world, and the courage required to stand up for basic human decency, even when it might be professionally or socially costly. Ricardo Vega's career never recovered from the interview. Within weeks, he was removed from his hosting position, and despite attempts to rebrand himself and find new opportunities, he became primarily known as the journalist who suggested that suffering children might be actors. His name became synonymous with a particular kind of media cynicism that the public had decisively rejected. Ronaldo, meanwhile, never spoke publicly about the interview again, preferring to let his words from that night stand on their own. But privately, he continued to support organizations providing aid to children in conflict zones around the world, and he made it a point to visit hospitals and refugee centers where he could spend time with young people who had experienced the kind of trauma that some preferred to question rather than address. The interview became required viewing in journalism schools as an example of how the pursuit of controversy can lead to moral bankruptcy, and in ethics classes as a demonstration of how individuals can use their platforms to defend human dignity against those who would diminish it. But for those who watched it live, or who discovered it in the days and weeks that followed, it served as a reminder that in a world where cynicism often masquerades as sophistication, there is still profound power in choosing compassion over skepticism, and in insisting that some things, like the suffering of children, are too sacred to be treated as fodder for provocative television.